Welcome to Women, Wounds, and Wake Up Calls, the series. I am so glad we are doing this. And I am pretty sure that something here will resonate with you. And if not you, oh, definitely it will resonate with someone that you know. So please don't keep this to yourself. Share it with your friends and people that you care about. And so let me begin, first of all, with something that I think may sound uncomfortable at first. And it is this, that many women did not learn how to love, but rather they learned how to disappear. It wasn't obvious, though. It wasn't sudden or dramatic, but it was slow and quiet and often very early in life, long before a woman entered her first serious relationship, before marriage, before heartbreak, and even before betrayal. Many women have already absorbed a silent lesson. What is it? That love means shrinking, bending, or making space for someone else, even if it means erasing parts of yourself. And the troubling part is this: most women aren't even aware that they were taught this. They simply believe this is what love looks like. But I want to talk about the lies that women learn early. It's the lies that show up even in our childhood stories. I hope you're not teaching them to your children if you have children. These lies also shows up in family dynamics, in subtle expectations, and eventually in relationships where a woman gives more and more of herself away until one day she wakes up and wonders, how on earth did I disappear inside my own life? Again, these ideas, these lies begin in childhood narratives. Many of them do. So I want you for a moment to think about the stories that you grew up with, that we grew up with. Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast, all the good girl stories. What patterns do you see when you really think about them? The woman is typically, or the girl is typically gentle, patient, long suffering, forgiving, understanding, sacrificial, compliant. She waits, she endures, she tolerates. And eventually, the story suggests that her patience and sacrifice are all going to be rewarded. But what these stories often quietly teach is something very different. They teach that a woman's virtue is measured by how much she can endure. Have you ever been told by someone that you are a good woman because of what you endured and tolerated by and from them, but not how clearly you can see or how strongly you can speak, nor how faithfully you can honor your own boundaries, but how much you can tolerate? These were often the ideas that were taught in these stories. And like I said, they began forming very early in the mind of a girl. Because when we listen to these stories, they, on the surface, intend to entertain, or at least that's what we believe, because those that are reading the stories or suggesting that we read these stories are people that we trust. In the school system, it's education, it's fun time, or they're our bedtime stories. But let's take one of these stories and look at it more closely. Well, we're going to look at a couple of them, actually, I believe, but let's start with this one: Cinderella, which I call the first lie. Okay. Most of us remember Cinderella as a story about hope. and kindness and about dreams coming true. But what if we paused for a moment, excuse me, and looked at that story the way an anthropologist might, or a psychologist, or even a philosopher that's studying the ideas that quietly shape women or a culture? Because if we slow down and watch that story carefully, Cinderella is doing more than entertaining children. It is teaching girls something about love, identity, and self worth. And the lesson begins with Cinderella's situation. She's a young girl living in a home, or a young woman living in a home where she is mistreated and overlooked. She is not valued for her voice. She is not respected for her strength. She survives by being gentle, compliant, and accommodating. She does not challenge the injustice around her. She simply endures it. And right there, the story introduces its first quiet message. Good women endure suffering quietly. In comes the fairy godmother. Something extraordinary happens at Cinderella's lowest moment. The fairy godmother appears. This magical figure becomes the solution to everything Cinderella cannot fix herself. Pumpkins become carriages, mice become horses, and rags become gowns. And suddenly, Cinderella becomes something else entirely. She becomes visible, seen. But notice what has happened. Cinderella does not escape her suffering again through her own hands and her own agency, nor does she confront injustice. She does not change her circumstances using her own voice. Instead, she is transformed by an outside force that prepares her to be seen by somebody else. I want you to think about that for a moment because that symbolism is powerful. Because the story quietly suggests that a woman's transformation comes when she becomes desirable enough to be noticed. Not when she claims her own power, but when she becomes beautiful enough to attract the attention of the prince. Now, I want you to look closely at what the fairy godmother actually does. She begins to adorn Cinderella, to dress her, to transform her appearance from something ordinary into something extraordinary. It was only then that the story tells and suggests to us that Cinderella becomes radiant, elegant, mesmerizing. And where is she taken after all of that? Well, to the ball. The ball is a setting where women are essentially displayed for the attention of a prince. Now, can you just imagine a young girl absorbing this story? What lesson might she begin to internalize? I imagine it's something like this. If I become beautiful enough, desirable enough, noticeable enough, somebody important will see me. And when he does, my life will change. That is the second quiet lie. The belief that a woman's destiny is unlocked through being chosen, seen. Then there is the anxiety that's created about the clock. Again, seemingly innocent in the story, but it is a fascinating detail because Cinderella's transformation actually comes with a deadline, right? Midnight. What happens at midnight? Well, at midnight, all the magic disappears. The gown becomes rags again. The carriage becomes a pumpkin. And so everything returns to what it was before. And for Cinderella, she returns to being invisible again. And that small detail, folks, carries huge psychological symbolism because what it's doing is introducing an idea that the opportunity to be chosen is temporary, that beauty is fleeting. There's a time clock on that, there's an expiration date. And that desirability, being chosen, being a desirable woman, has a window. And that attention has to be captured before the time runs out. And suddenly, y'all, the parallels, even with modern culture today, become very impossible to ignore. Oh, yeah, there's a connection. Women are being told, often told, outright or even subtly, that there is a window of time in which they must be chosen. We might call it a biological clock. I call it also a cultural clock. But it is, in fact, both are an invisible pressure whispering in my ear, your ear, her ear, our ears. Become it desirable, become noticeable, and do it quickly before time runs out. Now, let's pause for a second here because I really, really want you to stop and get quiet and to begin to picture something here. Let's move away from Cinderella for a moment. And now imagine a little girl sitting on the floor of her living room. Maybe she's 6, maybe she's 7 years old. She's watching Cinderella for the first time. She watches as Cinderella sweeps that floor, as Cinderella's being treated cruelly, unfairly. She watches as Cinderella stays kind and sweet and compliant, patient. And then something all of a sudden magical happens. This fairy godmother appears. The transformation begins. Then appears the dress, the carriage, the beauty. And then the moment when Cinderella walks into that ballroom and everyone turns around to look at her. And somewhere in that little girl's mind, a quiet message begins to form, one she may never say out loud to anybody else, but it settles in her imagination like a seed does in the soil. And it is this: one day, someone will notice me just like that. One day, someone will see me. They will see that I'm good. One day, someone will choose me. And what that little girl does not realize is that she has just learned something about love, not from experience, but from a fairy tale. Now let's move to a story I call The Second Lie, and that's Beauty and the Beast. At first glance, Beauty and the Beast appears to carry a beautiful message. Look beyond appearances is the message, right? Love transforms people. But when we slow down and examine that story carefully, another psychological lesson begins to appear. Because in this story, the woman enters a relationship with somebody who is frightening, a beast. And this beast is angry, hostile, and unpredictable, emotionally volatile. He yells, he intimidates, he isolates her inside his castle. And yet the story quietly asks all of us to believe something. If beauty is patient enough, kind enough, compassionate enough, I'm getting tongue-tied here, her love will eventually transform him. Her presence will soften him. Her gentleness will redeem him. And eventually, the beast will change. Now, I want you to pause and I want you to consider what message that plants in the minds of a young girl or young girls. The lesson becomes something like this: if someone is broken or hurt or angry, or even if they are hurtful to me, disrespectful to me, unkind to me, maybe my love can heal them. Maybe if I'm just patient enough, understanding enough, loyal enough, they will change. But, folks, this belief follows many women directly into adulthood. It shows up when a woman stays in relationships hoping love will transform somebody. But love cannot transform someone who refuses to take responsibility for their own behavior. And patience cannot heal someone who refuses accountability. Yet many women stay longer than they should because somewhere inside them lives the story that love redeems the beast. It's a quiet conditioning, which are the worst kind. And so by the time many girls become teenagers, that conditioning gets deeper. Girls, then, it doesn't help, are being praised for being agreeable and accommodating and selfless and emotionally responsible for others. And if tension exists in a room, girls are often taught to smooth things over, to fix it, to comfort, to absorb the emotional weight. And this teaches girls something very, very dangerous. It is that her value is somehow tied to how well she manages other people's needs, while her own needs continue to feel inconvenient or too much or selfish or unspiritual. And so the shrinking begins. In psychology, there's a phrase we often use called attachment injuries. And beneath many of these patterns that I've described are often attachment wounds, where a child may learn that love is connected to approval, performance, silence, or compliance. And they conclude that if I upset someone, love might leave or disappear. So what do? They adapt. The young girl learns to read the room, to maintain harmony. But listen, the same skill that might have protected that child will definitely harm the adult woman. She may spend years managing other people's emotions while ignoring her own. Her lessons become survival patterns: accommodating, avoiding conflict, over explaining, taking responsibility for everybody else's feelings, staying too long in unhealthy relationships. From the outside, yeah, it may look like devotion, but internally, it may actually be fear. Fear of what? Fear of losing someone, fear of losing connection, fear of losing what you desperately need and want to hold on to, fear of disappointing somebody, fear of being perceived as selfish. And so the woman continues what? Adjusting, giving, disappearing until love becomes something very different than what she imagined. It becomes self betrayal. Now imagine another scene. Not a little girl this time, but a grown woman. She's sitting in her car after a very difficult conversation, or she may be lying awake at night, replaying the same question: why do I keep trying so hard? Why do I keep explaining myself? Why do I keep hoping things will change? And somewhere inside her are echoes of those old stories. Maybe if I'm patient enough or understanding enough, maybe if I love better, eventually he will change, things will change. But sometimes awakening begins when she asks a very different question. Not how can I love better, but why have I been accepting so little in return? And that question, my friends, often begins the real awakening. Now, to my spiritual sisters, for many women of faith, this dynamic becomes even more complicated because spiritual language can reinforce the shrinking. Words like sacrifice, submission, servanthood, and patient becomes something else, right? Because many things often gets lost underneath these very virtuous sounding words. You see, God never asked women to erase themselves. He never asked women to abandon their voice or their boundaries or their identity. Healthy love is built on mutual honor. Now, here are some smelling salts, because this is the part many women do not realize until much, much later in life. And that is, they were not just enjoying a fairy tale when they were little girls. They were being given a script that quietly taught them that love is something you earn by being patient enough and gentle enough or beautiful enough, agreeable enough until finally somebody chooses you. But here is the part the story never tells you, that while Cinderella was waiting to be chosen, she actually never learned how to choose herself. And that is how the lie works. You see, it doesn't destroy a woman all at once. It simply teaches her slowly and quietly to trade pieces of herself for the hope of being loved, until one day she looks up and asks, "Where did I go?" Because in the process of trying to become someone worthy of the prince's attention, she slowly began to disappear. And here is my challenge to you. If this conversation resonated with you, I want you to tell me in the comments. And I want you to also answer this question: what message about love did you learn growing up? And if you want to go a little further and explore this deeper, this is actually part of the Women Wounds and Wake Up Call series, as well as the book. And in the series, though, we unpack the emotional beliefs that quietly shape women's relationships. Oh, I hope that this has touched you deeply, given you pause, and is triggering some really good actions for your future.